2,500. That is the number of names written on thin strips of tissue paper, folded into tight scrolls, sealed inside glass jars, and buried under an apple tree at a house on Lekarska Street in Warsaw. Each name had two versions. The first was the name the child was born with: Rachel, Moshe, Hannah, David. The second was the name the child would learn to answer to: Maria, Joseph, Katarzyna, Stanisław. Between those two names stood the distance between life and death, and the woman who wrote them, who memorized the code, who carried children out of a walled ghetto in coffins, in potato sacks, in the false bottoms of toolboxes, and once inside the compartment beneath a stretcher in an ambulance, while a trained dog barked to cover the sound of a crying infant. That woman stood 4 feet 11 inches tall, weighed barely 100 pounds, and never once in her life fired a gun. Her name was Irena Sendler, and the world did not know her name for 60 years. To understand what Sendler did, you first have to understand the geography of death she operated inside. In November 1940, the German occupation authorities sealed off a 16-block area of central Warsaw and declared it the Jewish residential district. Behind a 10-foot brick wall crowned with barbed wire, close to 400,000 human beings were compressed into an area of roughly 1.3 square miles. The population density was approximately 7.2 people per room. The Nazi administration allocated food rations for the ghetto at approximately 200 calories per person per day, a figure designed not to sustain life, but to manage the pace of dying. Typhus, dysentery, spotted fever, and tuberculosis moved through the ghetto with seasonal regularity. Corpses, some covered with newspapers, some not covered at all, lined the sidewalks in the morning. Children, smaller and more metabolically vulnerable, died faster than adults. By the time the mass deportations to Treblinka began in July 1942, an estimated 83,000 people had already died inside the ghetto from starvation and disease alone. This was the world Irena Sendler walked into, voluntarily, sometimes twice a day, wearing a Star of David armband she put on out of solidarity, not because she was Jewish. She was not. Irena Stanisława Sendler, born Krzyżanowska on February 15, 1910, was a Polish Roman Catholic from the town of Otwock, a short distance southeast of Warsaw. Her father, Dr. Stanisław Krzyżanowski, was a physician who specialized in treating tuberculosis. Otwock was roughly 50% Jewish, and its Jewish residents were disproportionately poor. Most local doctors refused to treat them. Stanisław treated everyone. He would tell his daughter a phrase she carried for the rest of her life: "If someone else is drowning, you have to give a hand." In February 1917, Dr. Krzyżanowski contracted typhus from the very patients his colleagues had refused to see. He died. Irena was 7 years old. After his death, leaders of the Jewish community in Otwock offered to help pay for Irena's education. She grew up playing with Jewish children, speaking fluent Yiddish by the age of 6. At the University of Warsaw, she studied Polish literature. When, in the mid-1930s, Polish universities began enforcing the so-called ghetto bench system, an informal rule forcing Jewish students to sit on the left side of lecture halls, separated from Catholic students, Irena defaced her own grade card in protest, crossing out the mark that identified her as non-Jewish. She was suspended from the university for 3 years. By September 1939, when Germany invaded Poland, Irena Sendler was 29 years old and working as a senior administrator in the Warsaw Social Welfare Department. When the ghetto was sealed, she faced a logistical problem that would have stopped most people. She was on the outside, and the people who needed her were on the inside, and between them stood a wall, armed guards, and a policy that made unauthorized entry punishable by death. Sendler solved this problem with bureaucracy. Because her department was responsible for public health, She obtained a pass from the Epidemic Control Department. The Nazis feared typhus spreading beyond the ghetto walls that gave her legal authority to enter the ghetto for sanitary inspections. She exploited this pass relentlessly. She entered the ghetto carrying her official bag with its false bottom. Inside the bag, beneath a layer of paperwork, she smuggled food, doses of typhus vaccine, small amounts of money, and sometimes candy or dolls for the children. But by the summer of 1942, food and medicine were no longer enough. In July, the Germans began the Großaktion Warschau, the systematic deportation of Warsaw's Jews to the Treblinka extermination camp. Between July and September 1942, approximately 280,000 men, women and children were loaded onto cattle cars at the Umschlagplatz and transported to the gas chambers. 280,000 people in 70 days. When the deportations slowed, not because the Germans had changed their minds, but because they were running out of people to deport, roughly 60,000 Jews remained in the ghetto. The community had been reduced by more than 70% in 10 weeks. It was in this context that the Council for Aid to Jews, known by its code name Żegota, was formally established in December 1942, growing out of a provisional committee founded by the writer and resistance fighter Zofia Kosak-Szczuka. Żegota was chaired by Julian Grobelny and funded by the Polish government in exile through the underground government delegation. It was a rare thing in occupied Europe, an organized, cross-political underground network whose explicit purpose was to save Jewish lives. And it was into this network that Irena Sendler brought the full weight of her position, her access, and her obsessive attention to documentation. Sendler did not work alone. Her core network consisted of approximately 20 to 25 operatives, most of them women, recruited from the 10 district centers of the Warsaw Social Welfare Department. Among them were Irena Schultz, who held a similar epidemic control pass, and Jadwiga Piotrowska, whose home served as the first stop for children after they crossed to the Aryan side. Each member of the network understood the penalty for their work. In occupied Warsaw, the punishment for hiding a Jewish person was execution, not just of the individual, but often of the entire household. Every door that opened for a child was a door that might bring death to everyone behind it. The methods of extraction were as varied as the situations demanded. There were 5 primary escape routes documented by the network itself. First, the ambulance. Sendler's epidemic control work gave her access to an ambulance that could legally transport patients suspected of having typhus. Children, whether genuinely ill or not, were hidden beneath the stretcher or under dirty rags on the ambulance floor. The Nazis were terrified of infectious disease and typically performed only cursory inspections before waving the vehicle through. On some runs, Sendler brought along a medium-sized dog that she had trained to bark on command. When a sedated child began to stir or a baby started to cry, she would step on the dog's paw, triggering frantic barking that in turn set off the German patrol dogs. In the confusion, guards would lose patience and wave the ambulance through. Second, the courthouse. An old courthouse sat on the border between the ghetto and the Aryan side of Warsaw. It had entrances on both sides of the wall. Children could enter through the ghetto side door and exit through the Aryan side door. It was a matter of timing, nerve, and forged paperwork. Third, the sewers and underground passages. Older children, those capable of walking and keeping silent, were led through the stinking, lightless sewer tunnels beneath Warsaw's streets. The physical horror of crawling through sewage was, for these children, the price of survival. Fourth, the church. At least one Catholic church in the ghetto had the same architectural advantage as the courthouse. One entrance inside the ghetto, one outside. Children entered the church as Jews. They exited as Christians, carrying new baptismal certificates, new names, and new histories they would have to memorize before the day was over. Fifth, the direct methods. For infants and toddlers who could not walk, could not be reasoned with, and could not keep quiet, Sendler and her team used whatever concealment was available. Potato sacks, gunny bags, a mechanic's toolbox, crates marked as supplies, body bags, and, according to multiple sources including the Jewish Women's Archive and the Chabad Documentation Project, coffins, small wooden boxes designed to carry the dead, repurposed to carry the living. At least one child was carried past Nazi guards in a carpenter's box. Elżbieta Fichowska was 5 months old when she was placed inside that box, smuggled out of the ghetto, and delivered to a Polish family on the other side of the wall. Each child who crossed that wall faced the same impossible arithmetic. The parents who gave their children to Sendler's network understood what they were doing. These were not casual handoffs. According to testimony recorded by the USC Shoah Foundation, Sendler described the conversations with parents as agonizing. She would knock on a door in the ghetto, identify herself, and ask a mother or father to give up their child, with no guarantee of survival, no guarantee of reunion, and the near certainty that the parent would never see the child again. She described these conversations as the hardest moments of her life, harder even than the torture that would come later. Some parents agreed, some refused, and Sendler would return the next day, and the next, until they agreed, or until the deportation trucks arrived first. Mothers would sometimes hand over their babies and then chase after the ambulance, screaming, changing their minds, before being pulled back into the ghetto by neighbors who knew that a scene would get everyone killed. On the other side, the logistics of concealment were equally complex. Each child needed a new identity, a Polish name, a baptismal certificate, a plausible backstory. Each child needed a placement, a foster family, an orphanage, a convent, a school. Sendler's network used institutions across Warsaw and beyond, including the Rodzina Marie orphanage in Warsaw and religious institutions run by nuns in Chotomów and Turkowiec near Lublin. Her office issued at least 400 forged documents under her personal responsibility. The Social Welfare Department's 10 district centers each contributed at least one person to the forging and placement operation. The Central Welfare Council, a Polish relief organization tolerated by the German administration, provided additional cover. And then there was the list. This is the part of the story that separates Irena Sendler from almost every other rescuer in the history of the Holocaust. She understood something that rescue alone could not accomplish. Without identity, the children would be saved but also erased. They would grow up not knowing their own names, their parents' names, their religion, their history. They would survive the war and lose themselves. So Sendler created what she called her file, a system of narrow strips of tissue paper, each one recording 2 names in code. On the left, the child's new Christian identity. On the right, their original Jewish name, the names of their parents, and the location where the child had been placed. According to her own testimony recorded by the USHMM, the coded entry might read something like Marysia Kowalska equals Raquela Rosenberg, hidden in such and such a convent. 2,500 entries. 2,500 children with dual identities, their real selves folded into strips of paper no wider than a finger. Sendler kept this file at her home. She understood that this list was simultaneously the most valuable and the most dangerous document in occupied Warsaw. If the Gestapo found it, 2,500 children would be identified, located, and murdered, along with every family and institution sheltering them. The list was a map of survival, and a potential death warrant for thousands. So Sendler took the strips of paper, placed them in glass jars, some accounts say milk bottles, and buried them under an apple tree in the backyard of her colleague Jadwiga Slomczynska's home on Lekarska Street. The apple tree stood there, unremarkable, while beneath its roots lay the names of 2,500 children. And for a time, the system worked. Then October 20th, 1943 arrived. The Gestapo had arrested a woman who ran a laundry that the underground used as a message drop point. Under torture, the woman broke and revealed names. One of those names was Irena Sendler's. At approximately 4 in the afternoon, 11 Gestapo agents pounded on the door of the apartment where Sendler was meeting with friends. According to the Jewish Women's Archive account, as the agents came up the stairs, Sendler threw a small package out the window to a friend standing below, who caught it and hid it under her arm. That package contained the most recent version of the coded list. The search of the apartment lasted 3 hours. The Germans found nothing. Sendler and her colleagues had already hidden the incriminating documents and a large sum of Żegota money intended for the family's sheltering children. But they arrested her anyway. She was taken first to Gestapo headquarters on Sucha Avenue, the most feared address in occupied Warsaw. In her own testimony, preserved in the USHMM Oral History Archive, Sendler described the interrogation with devastating plainness. A young, well-mannered German officer who spoke fluent Polish demanded the names of Żegota's leadership, the addresses of every operative, and the location of the list. Sendler said nothing. The interrogation shifted from questions to violence. They beat her. They tortured her. According to the Jewish Women's Archive, the Holocaust Memorial Day Trust, and multiple biographical sources, Nazi soldiers broke the bones in her feet and legs, crippling her for life. In her own words, recorded decades later, "They beat me, tortured me, hence you know, my bad legs." She was transferred to Pawiak prison, the most notorious detention facility in Warsaw. Most prisoners who entered Pawiak did not leave alive. Sendler was sentenced to death. She spent 3 months inside, enduring repeated interrogations. She never revealed a single name, not one child, not one address, not one colleague. As she explained in her USHMM testimony, Żegota understood the stakes clearly. She was the only person who knew the complete coded file. If she was killed, 2,500 Jewish children would never find their way back to the Jewish community because nobody else knew the code or where the list was buried. So Żegota did what underground organizations sometimes did in occupied Warsaw. They bribed. Julian Grabelny, the chairman of Żegota, coordinated the operation. Money was delivered to a German official. On the day scheduled for Sendler's execution, the morning she was to be led to the courtyard and shot, a guard led her down a corridor. But instead of turning toward the execution yard, he turned toward the street. He opened a door. He told her to run. She ran. Behind her, on the public bulletin boards that the Germans used to announce executions, her name was posted among the dead. Officially, Irena Sendler had been executed. In reality, Irena Sendler was limping through the streets of Warsaw on shattered legs, carrying a false identity under the name Klara Dąbrowska, still hunted by the same Gestapo that believed they had already killed her. And she did not stop. Even after the escape, even with the Gestapo searching for her, even living under a false name and unable to attend her own mother's funeral because appearing in public could expose the entire network, she continued. She coordinated placements. She managed funds. She maintained contact with the families sheltering children. During the Warsaw Ghetto uprising in April and May 1943, her group had created emergency shelters, private apartments where Jews who escaped the fighting could be temporarily housed, while Żegota produced documents and found longer-term hiding places. Even after her arrest, this system continued to function because she had built it to survive without her. When the war ended and the Soviet army entered Warsaw, Sendler's first act was to go to Lekarska Street. She and a friend dug beneath the apple tree, searching for the glass jars. According to one account from the Georgia Commission on the Holocaust, the original site had been reduced to rubble, and the jars had to be located in the debris. Other accounts suggest the jars were found intact. What is certain is that the lists were recovered. The strips of paper, the coded names, they had survived the war. Now came the cruelest part. Sendler took the lists and began the work of finding the children. One by one, she cross-referenced the coded names with the placement records. She contacted the families, the convents, the orphanages. She searched for the parents whose names were written on the right side of each strip of paper. And in almost every case, the parents were dead. They had been gassed at Treblinka. They had starved in the ghetto. They had been shot in the streets during the deportations. Only 1% of the Jews of the Warsaw Ghetto survived the war. The children Sendler had saved were, overwhelmingly, orphans. The list that was designed to reunite families instead became a record of what had been destroyed, and a proof that these children, these specific human beings with these specific names, had once belonged to someone. Żegota leader Adolf Berman arranged for roughly 400 of the children to emigrate to what would become Israel. Some were adopted by their Polish foster families and never learned their Jewish identities. An estimated 500 were never found. They may have died during the war. They may have survived under their Christian names and lived out their lives in Poland or elsewhere, never knowing who they really were. The list preserved their identities, but the chaos of post-war Europe could not always deliver them back. And then the silence fell. When the communist regime took power in Poland after the war, the narrative of wartime resistance was rewritten. The communists had their own version of who had fought the Nazis and who deserved recognition. Żegota, which was connected to the Polish government in exile in London and to non-communist political factions, was not part of the approved story. Irena Sendler was branded a subversive. Her work was not celebrated, it was punished. The woman who had saved 2,500 children was interrogated by the post-war security apparatus and marginalized. In 1965, Yad Vashem in Jerusalem recognized Sendler as one of the righteous among the nations. A tree was planted in her honor in 1983, next to the tree of Raoul Wallenberg. But in Poland, and in the wider world, almost nobody knew her name. Her story remained buried, not under an apple tree this time, but under decades of political suppression and historical indifference. Consider the asymmetry. Oskar Schindler saved approximately 1,100 people and became the subject of one of the most celebrated films in cinema history. Irena Sendler saved approximately 2,500 children and remained unknown. Schindler was a man, an industrialist, a figure whose story fit a narrative the post-war world could understand. A flawed hero operating within the machinery of capitalism. Sendler was a woman, a social worker, a bureaucrat who used paperwork as a weapon. Her story did not fit neatly into any framework that Hollywood or popular memory was prepared to embrace. It took 4 teenagers from a rural high school in Uniontown, Kansas, to change this. In 1999, a teacher named Norman Conrad showed his students a single sentence from a 1994 article in U.S. News and World Report. The sentence stated that Irena Sendler had saved 2,500 children from the Warsaw Ghetto in 1942 and 1943. Conrad and the students, Megan Stewart, Elizabeth Cambers, Jessica Shelton, and Sabrina Coons, were certain it was a typo. They assumed the article meant 250. How could one person save 2,500 children from a walled, guarded ghetto? They began researching for the National History Day competition. They discovered it was not a typo. They discovered Irena Sendler was still alive, 90 years old, in a nursing home in Warsaw, confined to a wheelchair because of what the Gestapo had done to her legs 56 years earlier. The students wrote a play. They called it Life in a Jar. They won their state competition. The play spread. It was performed across the United States, and then in Poland, and then internationally. Performances in Warsaw drew audiences that included elderly Polish men who had been recognized by Yad Vashem decades earlier but had hidden their medals in their basements, telling no one, not their children, not their friends, not their co-workers, because communist Poland had made their wartime heroism a liability. At one performance, a man sat clutching something in his hands throughout the entire play. Afterward, he opened his hands to reveal his Yad Vashem medal. He had kept it buried for 60 years. He said that because of these American students, he could finally show it proudly. The children Sendler had saved, now elderly themselves, had never forgotten her. Many considered her a mother figure. They visited her regularly. They brought their children and grandchildren to meet the woman who had carried them out of a ghetto in a sack, in a toolbox, in a coffin. In 2003, she received the Order of the White Eagle, Poland's highest civilian honor. In 2007, she was nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize. She did not win. The prize that year went to Al Gore and the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. Irena Sendler died on May 12, 2008, at the age of 98. She spent the last years of her life saying the same thing, over and over, to anyone who called her a hero. According to multiple recorded interviews, she said, "Let me stress most emphatically that we who were rescuing children are not some kind of heroes. Indeed, that term irritates me greatly. The opposite is true. I continue to have pangs of conscience that I did so little. I denounce every child saved with my help is the justification of my existence on this earth, and not a title to glory." Marek Edelman, the last surviving commander of the Warsaw Ghetto uprising, said upon her death, "A great person has died, a person with a great heart, with great organizational talents, a person who always stood on the side of the weak." By the time of her death, the 2,500 children she had saved had produced an estimated 1,250 children of their own, more than 600 grandchildren, and a growing number of great-grandchildren. These are human beings who exist, who breathe, who think, who love. Because a woman who stood 4 feet 11 inches tall decided that the bureaucratic machinery of a social welfare department could be turned into a weapon against genocide. Because she understood that a pass for epidemic control was also a pass into hell. Because she knew that a coffin could carry the living as well as the dead. Because she believed that a name written on a strip of tissue paper and sealed in a glass jar and buried under an apple tree was not a sentimental gesture, but an act of radical defiance, a refusal to let the machinery of extermination erase not just the lives, but the identities of the people it consumed. 2,500 names, buried under an apple tree, written by a woman the world forgot for 60 years. The names survived, the tree survived, and the children grew up